Hello, it's Justin Coletti of SonicScoop, and we are checking out a new plugin today. This is a multi-band clipper by a company called Soundtheory, known as Kraftur. It's the newest plugin from Soundtheory. These guys have made a huge brand for themselves based off of one plugin so far. That one plugin was Soundtheory's gullfoss, and gullfoss has been considered kind of a must-have for a lot of engineers as a mixed bus and mastering EQ. It was one of the really first intelligent, adaptive EQs before AI was all over the place, and it's still something that gets used a lot today. People especially like it for smoothing out high frequencies. We'll talk a little bit about gullfoss, but really what's on the agenda for today is a totally new plugin. This thing is called Kraftur, and Kraftur is a totally different take on EQ. We're going to hear it and see it together, and I've got someone from Soundtheory here with me to make sure we've got our whole story right. His name is Eddie Ruff. Eddie, thanks so much for being with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool. So before we get it right from your mouth about why you designed this thing, what makes it special, what it's supposed to do, I just want to give people the general idea here. It is a clipper, and a clipper, for those of you who don't know what clipping is, it's basically really, really fast dynamic range control. A clipper is different than a limiter in the respect that anything that passes above a threshold, if we're talking about hard clipping, anything that passes above a threshold is instantly pulled down. And anything below that threshold isn't touched at all. So you can almost think of a clipper as being a limiter or compressor with an instantaneous attack and release time. Things above the threshold get controlled, things that aren't above it don't. There's also soft clipping, which means that there's kind of a softer knee to the threshold, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and ideas there. But clipping has benefits and drawbacks over limiting. A lot of people these days love clippers for getting sounds really loud. And we can often get some clipping going on before we hear a ton of distortion artifacts. If you push a clipper really hard, it can sound distorted, but you can get fewer of the pumping and breathing artifacts that you might get from a limiter when you're using a clipper. So a lot of these days, when people are doing masters and trying to get them really hot, a lot of folks are going through clippers before they hit their limiters. And I believe that one of the reasons you designed Kraftur was to make it so that people could get even louder masters, even cleaner. But that's not necessarily all that it does. Give me your sense for this, Eddie. Have I given you a basic, decent overview of what Kraftur is meant to do, what makes it unique, or do you think there's anything I missed here?
Yeah, definitely. That's a pretty good overview. One point of clarification, I'm not the designer, so I run support at Soundtheory. There are a handful of developers that are based out in Germany and the UK, way smarter than me. I think a couple might be floating in the chat too. But yeah, they're the brains behind gullfoss and Kraftur, and we're really excited to share, this new plugin with everyone.
Good stuff. So the most obvious application here is going to be things like mix bus, is going to be things like maybe mastering applications. But I think you could also use this on individual elements. And I had a lot of fun playing around with, in particular, on drum kit. And we'll take a look at how it works on drums in just a minute. Also, I think there's applications here for things like basses and synths. We'll talk a little bit about that. But I think there's probably two ways of using this thing. I conceive of it two ways. One, you want to apply clipping, but you want to get even cleaner clipping than before. So you can say apply less clipping to your low frequencies than to your mid frequencies, or you can really just clip your high frequencies and leave everything else alone. So that's one way of using it, where you're targeting things in to say, hey, I don't want to hear the artifacts of clipping everywhere. I only want to clip certain portions. So you get even cleaner clipping and even louder, cleaner masters with it. That would be number one. And number two would be the exact opposite, saying, hey, I want to take one area and, push it to death, or, push one area super hard and get even more, use it more like a saturator. And I imagine both of those applications are possible. What do you think are some of the primary applications for this, and what kind of audio examples can you play us to demonstrate what this thing does?
Yeah, got a bunch of different audio examples, hopefully all royalty free, so we'll make sure that we don't get flagged for copyright or anything. But we'll go through those. I think in terms of clipping, the way I think of it is I go a little bit back just towards like analog, right? So electrically, what's happening, like if you've got an API or a Neve preamp, both of those have op amps in them, whether they're chip-based or discrete. And the voltage rails, right, that's like your min and max, and the signal sits in between those voltage rails. If you slam into those rails, you're literally out of headroom. So that's essentially where a hard clip comes from. Mastering engineers have kind of been doing that in the analog world for quite some time. They'll hit their A to D converters in a certain way that they're doing essentially hard clipping in the analog world to basically inflate that master and get a little bit more out of it. So with Kraftur, we're trying to essentially bring more things to the table with the multiband clipping. When you were doing that type of hard clipping in the analog world, it's essentially single band. Everything's kind of just in that one frequency group, and they're all getting the same type of clipping. But with Kraftur, you have offset and knee that changes, hard and soft clipping, and you've got the low, mid, and high shifts, and that's basically where the multiband comes in, and it's a totally different animal with that parameter set. So, yeah.
Yeah, very cool. And it does seem like a pretty simple layout here. We basically have this control up at the top that lets us balance between whether it's dry, your single band clipping, and your multi-band clipping. And I think this is one of the really novel things about exactly how you blend here. You've got drive, which is kind of your overall gain into the clipper, which is generally speaking, where there's a soft clipper first, and there is a hard clipper, I think, at the end of the chain. Offset and knee, that's going to play around with the slope of the clipper, so you can make it maybe even more of a soft clipper than a hard clipper. And then these shift controls, low shift, mid shift, and high shift, this is where you can make it dig in even more on low frequencies, mid frequencies, or highs. And then I believe you have control over the crossover as well of each of those on top. So we'll get into like kind of a how-to on using it. But before we do, let's get the people happy with some sound examples. Can you show us just an example, maybe on something like drums, where we could hear just what hard single band clipping would sound like, and then maybe what would be a benefit of switching into a multi-band clipping mode on something like that?
Yeah, sure. So this first example, it's not the most hi-fi, but it is pretty fun to listen to. It's actually Eric Valentine and Aaron Sterling. So Aaron Sterling's a killer drummer. They're essentially A-Bing different sugar percussion snare drums. So you'll hear talking, you'll hear snares, all that type of stuff. So yeah, I'll play the audio, and then I'll turn on match, and I'll play back and forth with the drive parameter, and then I'll move the triangle between single, multi, and dry.
Great. And that match is just doing
level matching, yeah. And is the audio okay, or do you want it up a little bit?
Lower, but
sounds good. Cool.
Really good though. Yeah, it has it's just a little more give to it.
So as it is right now, we're essentially not really doing too much with Kraftur.
Cherry.
As I go back between single and multi and dry.
Not
and
much
the way I
change.
can tell is our input histograms, which are down here, and these are their band meters, and the colors are all linked up together. So we've got the low, mid, high band, and then white is essentially the single band, right? Same labeling up here along the top. So right now there's essentially no hotness, and that's what we like to call when the band meters get driven harder. So as I increase drive, we now see this sort of white fluorescence here, and that's what we're calling hotness. So the single band is really being driven, and we can see a little bit on the mid band and the high band here. So I'll go back and forth with drive, and we can sort of listen to how that's digging in.
Very cool.
There's a clipping.
It's tuned a little lower, but
yeah.
Sounds
so
really good.
Obviously way at the extremes, we're sort of digging into it way too hard, and I'll give you guys some tips on where to look for in Kraftur to make sure that you're not hitting things super hard. There's actually a couple places which is pretty nice because you've got feedback almost everywhere. But yeah, in terms of single band and multi-band, so if I go 100% single, I'll bring the loop back, I'll drive it a bit too hard here, and I'll go back and forth between single and multi.
So it's tuned a little lower, but sounds really good though. Yeah, it has it's just a little more give to it. Okay, so when switch between that and here's the
So the difference, and it's going to be tough to come across on YouTube, but what I hear and the main thing I listen for is the snare, and you're going to definitely hear the snare change as you tweak offset and knee. But yeah, we can dig into those parameters later too.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a couple things that I'm hearing. Definitely between the dry and clipped sounds, especially when you're in multi, I definitely hear the difference a lot on the snare between dry and multi. But what's really interesting to me is that when you're in single band mode, the thing that's triggering the clipping the most is the kick drum. The kick drum has so much energy. There's so much low frequency energy in there. And you hear this this disparate amount of distortion and clipping on the kick drum relative to everything else in the kit. And whenever the kick hits, like the whole kit distorts just when the kick's hitting. And that's a very stereotypical, trashy sounding drum distortion kind of feel. But as soon as you go from single band mode to multi-band mode, all of a sudden it's not like the kick is the most clipped thing in the entire kit. Since they're being clipped differently, and you could even back off on the low shift a little bit, all of a sudden you get to hear a more similar amount of clipping on the kick and snare, instead of having the kick in the single band mode getting so much saturation compared to everything else. It just seems to be more evenly spread. Can you give us that, again, going back and forth between single and multi, and then back and forth between multi and dry, just so we can hear those differences one more time?
Yeah, sure. Push the drive up a little bit here. The default is just a 33% blend between all three of them, so it's equal.
It's tuned a little lower, but it sounds really good though. Yeah, it has, it's just a little more give to it. Okay, so when switch between that, and here's the cherry wood drum.
And I'll mention that we're doing all this comparison right now with match enabled, so
yes.
Match and bypass are in the upper two corners there. One thing to watch out for, so when you do go to 100% dry in the triangle, because these three audio paths are all on the oversampled path, 100% dry is not exactly the same thing as kicking in bypass.
Oh, interesting.
So that's one thing to just watch out for. But that's the reason why we have the triangle, right? Because now you can seamlessly blend between dry, multi, and single, and they're all phase compensated for. You're not going to have any weird issues there. But yeah, the thing we've also done, right, all of our shifts are sort of stacked on top of each other. So in terms of this transfer function here, everything's sort of lying on top of each other. But just like you said, Justin, if we wanted to affect the low end less, I can go negative on the low shift. And let's bring some audio back. We can even solo it up here. So now we're just listening to everything 350 hertz and below, that kick drum, which we were originally right here. And it doesn't sound too bad, but we're definitely piling up information. If you look right up here in this region, right, that's where the information's kind of getting bundled up, and that's all being hard clipped away. So as I go negative in my low shift, I'm now affecting that whole histogram less. I'm essentially giving it more headroom so that it's not getting that hard clipping right there. If I go the opposite way, we can get into some pretty gnarly territory. Right? Not something you probably necessarily want on a 2-bus or anything like that. But this is great because I can hear it and I can see it, and now I can dial in exactly how much I want. One thing to watch out for, though, is that just with, human perception, if I'm soloed on this low band, and let's say I do dig into it a little bit heavy, right, like this, I might think that's a very nasty kick drum distortion, but that could easily be masked when I bring back the full spectrum. It's less apparent to my ears, right? And I know that I'm driving it way too hard than what I normally would. So a lot of it's almost like the opposite of gullfoss, right? Gullfoss works with frequency masking, where you want to bring out those fine details and you want to reveal the information that was already in your audio. Kraftur is trying to, get everything pumped up, get your loudness way up there. And when you do hard and soft clipping, you don't want to hear it. Like, you've already got everything sitting in balance where you want it to be. You just want it to compete with other things that are out there. So it's really cool because you can dial in how aggressive you are on the clipping, and you might hear it when you're soloing a band, but once you start bringing everything back, it's still designed to be transparent and have minimal aliasing, right? You can't totally avoid aliasing, and you'll hear it more as you drive your settings, to crazy values. But the whole idea is to try and stay, as transparent as possible and get that extra 1 or 2 dB of, energy added back into your system. So
totally. And I could really hear just how much more transparent the clipping is even before you touch low shift, mid shift, or high shift, because what's effectively happening even before you mess with those is that there is like a separate trigger for each band. So in the initial example, when you set drive really high and you have it in single band, the mid frequencies are distorting and the high frequencies are all distorting when that kick drum is hitting. But all of a sudden, when you go into multiband mode, now the mid frequencies and the high frequencies have their own trigger. They have their own, key that they're listening to. So you're not getting the kick drum distorting your mid-range and your high frequencies. You're getting it just distorting the lows and just adding a little bit of saturation to the lows. And then if you want to go more transparent still, I imagine one way that people might use this is maybe just clipping in the high frequencies or something along those lines. And there are analog devices that do clip more in the higher frequencies than the lower frequencies. Could we hear a comparison back and forth between maybe really heavy clipping in the mids and highs versus heavy clipping in the lows and mids or something like that? Can you give us a feel for what clipping sounds like at different parts of the frequency spectrum?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll add in, like, the way I think about it, and this might be a little like a bad analogy, but single I think of as like a grayscale image, and the low, mid, high I think of as like your red, green, blue, where you can tailor those individual colors and get more precise. So my default is sort of leaving the low end less, increasing that headroom there on the low shift, and just what you said, on mid shift and high shift, really digging into those. So I'll sort of go through that process, and you'll watch me sort of dig into mid and high shift. When I'm dealing with those parameters, it's a good idea to be on 100% multi, just so you're hearing exactly what's going on, and then I'll switch between multi and single with those driven in. So
that'd be great.
So it's tuned a little lower, but
sounds really good though.
Yeah, it has it's just a little more give to it. Okay, so when
switch between that and here's cherry wood drum.
right, so cymbals super abrasive, but I'm actually listening for some of the rim shots when he does that. And it is going to be abrasive when you solo it, but
bark, yeah, we're talking about.
Bring it all back, totally slammed back off drive a little
Ebony.
bit.
There's that hard hitting mode.
Yeah. I'm telling you, but it has that low
So,
end. Now, obviously,
what I'm listening to now is still the snare.
but it has a little bit of that
Yeah,
low
exactly. There's a weird thing with the spatiality too, like the soundstage kind of opens up.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And we're digging in really hard, so this comes across on YouTube, but
Oh, totally. Now, this is more drive than you would ever use for mastering applications, just trying to get a master loud. This is way too much, but it does help us hear what's going on. And there are situations in which you would want, trashy sounding drums. And this is a way to give yourself a lot of control over trashy sounding drums. And there are going to be elements in any mix sometimes where you want something that's really grunged up, and you can do that with this. Or you could put this, I'm sure, at 1 to 3 dB of drive. We won't hear it at all. We won't hear some of these changes nearly as much. But for people who are listening really carefully, they could put it on 1 dB or 3 dB of drive and then say, ooh, I'm just hearing a little bit of grit on the kick drum or the bass. Let me back off on the lows. So we're just clipping mids and highs, and we'll get that level without that closed in pinched feeling. And for me, there was a big difference. When you went from single to multi, things just opened up. It felt more live. It felt louder, even at the same relative loudness. Really cool.
yeah, because we still have match engaged, so everything's been basically level matched. Match takes essentially it's like the inverse of input to like drive and your gain, but there's a little bit else going on where it does RMS matching too. So that's really, you leave match on while you're dialing in your settings over here on the left. And then when you're ready to actually benefit from that extra loudness from drive, you just turn match off and it's going to get way louder, right?
Yeah.
But that's what you want because it takes off that RMS matching, which has a little bit of like a compression effect too.
One of the other creative applications here that I think could be fun for people who are trying to be less subtle, maybe in electronic music production, would be automating this single multi-dry knob. I think that was really interesting just when you had it, set to stun and you're doing like 18 dB of drive and there was a ton going on, and just going from the single to the multi and then opening it up to the drive where all of a sudden there was a ton of clarity and you hear all of this crack and sustain come back in the dry control. That could be an interesting alternative way of doing the classic lo-fi effects that we hear so often in either bridges or the beginning of songs where things start lo-fi. And one of the common ways to do that is you get rid of a lot of lows, get rid of a lot of highs, and then bring it full spectrum. But just that feeling of going from the single or the multi level matched out to dry and automating that, man, that could be a cool alternative way of getting the kind of lo-fi to full-fi experience that is less explored, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this plugin, it's only, we released it like a month or so ago, so it's still new to me. But I think exactly what you said, like automating this red triangle, even with match off, would be a really cool thing to do. I don't think, so I'm in Studio One right now, and I'm not the most savvy. I'm coming from a Pro Tools world. But there are DAWs out there, I think, like Bitwig or some of the other ones that are a bit more savvy with automation. That would be a really cool thing, exactly what you mentioned, where you could dial in a setting that is just way over the top. Let's say you've got like an 808 thing and you're really digging in hard on the low end. And you would essentially leave the triangle at 100% dry and have some type of automation that's following, your beat or your music, where you're just sliding between dry and multi. Because 100% multi is just going to be too much crazy. But now if you kind of automate it just when that 808 hits, you can get like a really cool effect that's essentially hard clipping, but only on the parts that you want it.
You could get hard clipping just on the transient, but not on the sustain, or vice versa. Leave a totally untouched transient, but get the artifacts of clipping on the sustain. Really clever ways of dealing with that. We also have a bunch of questions coming in here. I want to take a whole bunch of these questions. Before we do, let's bring up one more sound example. I know you have a few loaded up. What's a different application for this outside of drums where we could hear some stuff? Then we'll switch to some questions, and then we'll hear some more audio examples again.
Yeah. Let me go way up here to the top. So this next one is a metal mix. It's one of my brother's bands, actually. And one question we get, right, we've only got 2 plugins so far, so do you do gullfoss first? Do you do Kraftur first? What's sort of the order of operations there? I'll start by saying there's no hard and fast rules, but what I like to do is put gullfoss first, sort of give it all the pieces of the puzzle before it's been mangled by anything else, like heavy compression or other things. And then I'll put Kraftur after that just to get my loudness back up to where it should be. Both of them, though, should definitely be before like your final limiter and your final metering. So in this session, really all I have is, on this particular track, gullfoss master and Kraftur. And then there is a final limiter way over here, but it's just kind of like a safety net. So yeah, I'll play sort of the beginning of this song. It's really heavy, it's really dark. It's going to be really quiet at first. We're going to brighten it up with gullfoss and sort of reveal some of the cymbals, make the drums and guitars a bit more clear. And then without match engaged, I'm going to play around with Kraftur and sort of get the loudness to where I want it and dial that in. So yeah, here we go. So we'll start with gullfoss. I'm zoomed in at plus and minus 3 dB, and we can see that we're doing quite a lot of activity. And if I bypass,
Yeah, definitely adding some clarity and detail.
yeah, it's like it's lifting a blanket off there. So these are pretty aggressive values for a master, but just adding in a bunch of high end. So we'll jump over to Kraftur after that. Kraftur is resizable, so you come down to this corner here, make this resizable. Let me double check that I've got everything zeroed out. All right. We'll turn Kraftur on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust drive so that my single band is just getting some hotness on the meter there. I'm going to bump it up. And now we are getting that loudness, right? Because I have match off. If I turn match on, I'm back down to where I was. But for this particular example, I want to hear the final result and where I'm at. I'm okay with that loudness jump. So I'll go 100% multi. And I'll start dialing in these bands here. Lots of low end down there. You notice the default is 350 hertz to 3.5 kilohertz. This I've actually lowered it, so I'm down at 200 hertz. And I want to leave that low end barely untouched. We'll go to the mids. And where I'm looking right now, I'm looking right over here at this -6. And I'm just kind of seeing how much information is sort of bundling up there, right? So there's really nothing. It's starting to bundle, yep. Right, the amplitude of that hill, so to speak, right? The bulk of that is his snare drum.
Yeah.
And when you do hover over the mid-band here, we do try to show sort of like a reflective, like a wave propagation, so that your input at the bottom hits that transfer curve and reflects over to the right. So you're kind of following those transients easier with your eye. But yeah, right now I'm slamming his snare in the mid-range. That's okay. So let's check out the highs. And this is 2K all the way on up. And we'll probably just touch it just a little bit. We don't want to get too aggressive. So 100% multi. Dry. So here maybe I'll kick match back in.
Oh yeah. The snare is so much cleaner in multi than single. So folks, listen for that.
And now I'll go between single and multi. I'll take match off just so we have our final loudness. I hear the stereo image, like when I'm on single, they are one unit right in front of my face, which is cool for some things. But when I go multi, like, even though this isn't more like a spatial plugin, I hear that soundstage open up and sort of, wrap around my head. So, yeah, super cool. And you can definitely, leave it in the middle if you want to just blend between all of them. So leaving it where it is right now, 2 plugins. And I go from, low loudness, dark, to a pretty decent stem master just with those 2 plugins. Had I have done Kraftur before gullfoss, some of the masked hard and soft clipping that Kraftur does could be recovered from gullfoss. And it could come through as something that that you're more easily to perceive when you're soloing the bands, and something you might not want. But that's why we have a free trial. So download the free trial, and you can play around with the order of it and see what you do and don't like.
Yeah, there's a few reasons that order makes sense. One of them is exactly what you mentioned, which is a little bit unique to gullfoss. But even with just EQ in general, if you are brightening things up, like you were with gullfoss in this case, where we're reducing low frequencies relative to high frequencies, that's going to impact our clipper. A lot of tracks, maybe 60, 70% of tracks in mastering need some brightening, and maybe need a little bit of low frequency reduction in certain spots. But if you are hitting the clipper before doing that, you're having all these low frequencies that you're going to get rid of, that you're going to reduce, triggering the clipper. And it's like, well, if you're going to reduce those low frequencies, you may as well do that with the EQ beforehand. So you're not having low frequencies that you're going to take away over impacting your clipper. Now, that said, with Kraftur, unlike other clippers, you can ameliorate this a bit by turning down low shift. If you're feeding it too much low frequency energy, you can turn down low shift a bit, and then you don't have that problem. But even with conventional EQs, I guess what I'm saying is that my preference is to run them before clipping. And I see clipping generally as the last, if not one of the last things in the chain before the limiter. Now, why it should go before... Yep. Now, why it should go before the limiter, for me, that's part of the reason people like clipping is, yeah, it could be tonal, like soft clipping, like I want saturation, but often it is for loudness. And can we get this thing louder without hearing the pumping and breathing artifacts of a limiter? And you're basically pre-limiting the peaks with a clipper, and having that go before the limiter makes more sense. If you have the limiter first doing a lot of limiting, then you get those pumping and breathing artifacts, and then peaks that got through are going to be adjusted by the clipper, and you're going to bring up the level. But you don't get that same benefit of having the limiter work less hard if you run the clipper after rather than before. Does that make some sense to you? Is that a decent way to explain it?
No, yeah, that's exactly. And there was actually a really good video someone put on YouTube, I think it was In the Mix, where he did exactly what you just said, where he used Kraftur to make his final limiter. I think he was, let's say, FabFilter Pro L2. Without Kraftur, Pro L2 was digging in, and it had to do, I don't know, 8 or 9 dB of makeup gain to get to the type of lufts that he wanted. And then when he used Kraftur and he dialed it in, he essentially, like Pro L2, I think it was like 1 or 2 dB, it didn't have to do anymore. And it wasn't like you just switched where those numbers were going, because Kraftur was only doing like, I think, a dB or so. It essentially increased the overall power of that signal. And that clipping wasn't really, it wasn't the same type of clipping that was going on in that limiter, and it was more pleasing, more transparent. So at those subtle settings, use Kraftur so that your final limiter doesn't have to dig in as hard. And there's tons of mix engineers that they do that same practice with everything, right? I'll have, I mean, not me personally, but I've heard of mix engineers that'll have 3 EQs, where each one is just doing, just a crack of low and high end, just half a dB or something. But together, all 3 of them are doing 3 to 4 dB. Same thing with compression. A lot of people don't like putting all the load on one compressor. They just want to see a little bit of needle movement on maybe 2 or 3 compressors. So I think Kraftur is going to be a good companion for other limiters in the market, where you can kind of split the load and get some cool effects with it too.
For sure. And again, my biggest thing here, I've got to echo you. When we listened to the before and after on that metal tune, there was the soundstage opening up in width. And I think there's reasons that happens. We no longer have the most dominant hits kind of clipping and flatlining everything. So it gives us more sense of separation and movement left and right. Also, I feel like I get this greater front to back. And also greater sense of perceived loudness. One of the big things for me is just hearing the transient and the snare come back in the multi versus the single version. So if you want clipping and you want to get lots of loudness out of clipping without overdoing it, the multiband idea is not so that you do more clipping, but so that you can either do less clipping by just reducing how much is happening in certain bands, or do even more clipping that you don't hear by reducing those bands that are going to be over clipping. Now, we have a ton of questions coming in I want to get to. I know you have like a couple more audio examples, and I want to hear them. Before we do, let me read some of these for you, and we'll go through them. So the first question, this has nothing to do with your plugins, is from Michael Murray, who asks what kind of headphones we're using. And I've gotten some Austrian audios here. I can't remember what model. These are the High X55s. Yours, it looks like, are maybe Bear Dynamics. What are you wearing today?
I'd have to check 1 second. Okay, the DT 1770 Pros.
Yes, that was Attell in here guessed it correctly. So Dark Trap asked, is the voice in the music? Yes, in that first clip, there was voices in the music, and I wish I'd said, actually, don't talk over this one, Eddie, because there's other guys talking in it. So hopefully that didn't confuse people too much.
You were listening to Eric Valentine and Aaron Sterling talk about snare drums, but yeah.
Yes, hopefully that wasn't too confusing for folks, but we did say that in the beginning, so hopefully folks caught that. He's asking if the parameters have already been explained, and I would say yes, more or less. The big parameter on the top left is where you can adjust between dry single band clipping and multi-band clipping. And then below that, we have our drive, which is basically how hard you're hitting it. And this does add gain as well as adding saturation, unless you click the match button in the top right, and then it's kind of volume normalized. Offset and knee, maybe you could slide those two for us. This just controls the knee and makes it, basically, the more you go to the right on either of these controls, the more it acts like a soft clipper rather than a hard clipper. It's already soft clipping, but this makes it even more soft clipper. And generally speaking, softer clippers are going to reduce less above the threshold, but start reducing sooner below the threshold. Do you think that's a decent way of describing it there, Eddie?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, my personal preference is I actually prefer hard clipping. But the visuals, right, just as you were talking over offset and knee, offset is going to deal with stuff that's essentially further down on the waveform, not necessarily right around that higher threshold where the transients live. Yep. And that's why we left those as 2 separate parameters, right? We could have combined them into one knee, but it would kind of get a little clunky. So offset deals with things that are lower than the harder transients there. Mm-hmm. And to the right, you're getting more soft. You're affecting lower on that waveform earlier. And to the left, it's just what Justin said, it's harder clipping. Knee, if you look at this curve, it's really only near that inflection point, and that's where it's going with the transients harder to softer. So if you did that on a track with some really nice, crisp, clear transients, whether it's drums, acoustic guitar, or whatever, you're going to hear knee have a greater effect, I think, than offset. So I typically grab offset and find that sweet spot. And then knee it's going to be a bit more aggressive, but you can also use a little bit of that as well. Fun fact, which I don't know if a lot of people have figured out, but the XY up down with your mouse over the display will adjust offset and knee. So I think if I go up down here, there's offset, and if I go left right, there's knee, and you can do in between if you're feeling adventurous. So
nice. And then up above, at the very top, we can adjust, we can solo low, mid, and high bands, and we can also adjust their crossovers by clicking the points in between. On the bottom left, there's the low shift, mid shift, high shift, so you can have more clipping on lows, mids, or highs, and it looks like there's a link function there as well. So once you get a blend you like, you can kind of move them together. And then at the far right, and then at the far right, there's a ceiling and a gain control, and this is a final output gain on the far right, as well as a ceiling for an additional clipper, a super hard clipper that's like right before the final stage. And that one sounds crunchier if you want like super hard straight clipping. There's a final clipper there, and you can adjust the ceiling of it with the ceiling control. And that's about all the controls on here.
That's pretty much everything. There's more behind the scenes. So far we've had that final clip button engaged. And it's a little unintuitive because you would think, okay, I've got 3 curves here for low, mid, and high, and then I've got my single curve in white. So let's say that's 4 wave shapers, right? 4 transfer curves. And then there's a final clip button. So maybe there's 5. I think under the hood, there's actually quite a few more clippers and things going on, especially to minimize aliasing. So right away, there's oversampling on everything. That's just on by default. It does change depending on your input sample rate, but it's at least 8 times oversampled. So if you start with a track where everything is zeroed out here, and you're already hearing like Kraftur is clipping something, it could be from this final clipper, which isn't just like one hard clipper. It's in the oversample domain, and there is a little bit of hard and soft clipping going on. But if you're hearing something that's already being like clipped away and you haven't even started playing with drive or anything, it could be coming from this clipper. So what that means, you've got 2 options. You can just turn it off and not worry about where your peaks are going to land if you've got a final limiter there, or leave it on, go back to drive, or even your clip gain if you need to, go negative. And that's why we have drive that lets you go negative, because when things come in and they're already too hot, right, they've already been squeezed to death, your band meters at the bottom are already going to be like, you'll see the hotness there. They're already be getting clipping even at a drive of 0. So then you could go negative on drive, giving yourself some headroom, putting those histograms in the right spot, and then dialing in your settings from there.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. All right, let's keep on going on to some more of these questions. Michael Murray asks, does Kraftur work in Reaper? And I guess the answer would be there would be yes, as a VST. So this is available VST, AAX audio unit, so it should work in basically any DAW that runs plugins, yeah?
Yeah, definitely. All the standard components. Since it is new, we're still working on a couple bug fixes, but I think those are isolated to Windows machines with Radeon GPUs. The cool thing about this plugin, and this is different than gullfoss, so we do have a bunch of different color schemes, but there's this dynamic range, right, between SDR, standard dynamic range, and HDR. Not every machine is going to support that, and our developers worked a really long time on this. We call it Vision Tone, and if you have a machine that supports it, it's really, like, I've never seen a plugin quite do what HDR can do, but like the colors just pop. So like on the triangle, when you're playing audio, there's like a slight laser speckle that's like, it kind of looks like noise almost. And then the clip button especially, right? It's like glowing neon. When you solo a band and you hover over this, those wave propagations, like all of that in terms of the lighting is just like pretty cool. None of that does anything for the sound, but we were pretty proud of, you know, all the cool stuff we came up with for that. So yeah, that's in there. You can also check that you've got the right version. So like the one user mentioned Reaper. If you're on Mac, make sure you've got Apple Silicon, because everything runs better, faster, cooler, more efficient on Apple Silicon. We do support the older Intel machines on Mac, so that's not an issue. I don't think Windows has ARM yet, do they? But if they do, we support it. We usually stay on top of that stuff pretty good. So, yeah,
Cool.
It supports every major DAW. I don't want to totally commit to this, but we've had a few users ask about Linux, and we're keeping an eye on that space. So that's all I'll say right now. We're more than capable of delivering for whatever the next generation of audio engineers. If they want to be on Linux on a Raspberry Pi or something, we'll keep our eye out for that.
All right. A few more questions here before we get to the last couple audio examples. Plong says, is it also good for single tracks or buses? And how's the CPU consumption? So let's take that one backwards, because your next audio examples are for single tracks. So first, how is the CPU consumption? Is this something you can run a lot of instances of it, or is it a CPU hog where you're just going to get away with a few of them in a session?
It's a little bit hungry. Let's see. So I've got, let me make this a little bit bigger. All right, so right now that one instance is about 14% on, let's say, one of the cores of this ARM processor. Latency's down at 0. That is not too bad. I would definitely stick to using it on sparingly in a session. If you're throwing it on every track, that's not the intended use. And the same goes for gullfoss, right? You can use it on individual tracks, but there's got to be some intention behind it. We didn't design gullfoss to be a lazy man's EQ. That you definitely need to still understand, traditional mixing topologies and everything. And gullfoss helps just get that extra 5-10%. Kraftur, same thing, but with loudness and with that spatial separation in the multiband.
Sure.
So yeah, CPU wise, it's not too bad. If I engage gullfoss master, I bet that's going to be, so that's higher up near the 2030 mark. But master's, totally maxed out in terms of quality. So that's a dedicated mastering session where you'd want that one. And then you got the latency again too on that. So 24 milliseconds.
Right. And there are
you can use it on
latency.
individual tracks.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And one of our first things that we talked about there was drum bus. I think that we're demonstrating it on drum bus because it's easy to hear the changes there. However, I think you could use it on drum bus in one of two ways: either A, to do soft clipping, maybe of just high frequencies on drums, or to get some of these exaggerated trash can effects where you're blowing out lows on purpose. That kind of creative application on drums could be interesting. But I think you had a couple of other ideas, maybe around kind of bass instruments and stuff. What were some of your other thoughts around single instruments? I think you had maybe some examples there.
Yeah. I've got examples. There's still full mixes, but the dominating element is definitely, let's say, a low-end element here. So let's go to this, which this one I hope is not explicit. It should be okay. Let's turn off the other crafters here. Okay. And we will resize it. Double check. Okay, so on this one, this goes back to that automation example. And I don't have it written in, but where I was talking about you would dial in something that's pretty disgusting on multi, especially on the low end, right? I'm going positive low shift. So this... whatever it is, 808 is going to be really digging in. But this is where you would essentially just automate between dry and multi and just blend that in with the beat.
Oh my God, I'm just playing with them now, yeah. Oh my God, what she saying, say it loud, yeah. I can't respect it, I'm in the gym, but I am not flexing. Came from a Ford, I'm needing a Lexus. Shooting like Luke, I told him I'm next, shit. Oh my God, I'm just playing with them now, yeah.
So that track started where it's already blown out. Really, I should be at negative drive, because if I put my drive at 0.
Oh my God, I'm just playing with them now, yeah. Oh my God,
that single band is already hitting into some hotness there. So if I was in the mindset of a delicate master, I would probably go negative drive and be way more subtle. But what I'm actually doing is 100% multi.
Oh my God, I'm just...
where that's totally bundling up that low end there, right?
Yeah.
I could back it off a little bit. Right, way too much, but I'm in solo.
Oh my God,
Bring it out.
Saying, say it loud, yeah.
And this would be perfect for like a Bitwig or a DAW that has, Ableton Live or something, where you would automate just on when that kick hits between dry and multi, and you just kind of tickle it in there, and now you've got an effect that's like, you're going to have other people asking, like, how did you do that?
Yeah. I could totally see using this thing just straight across an 808 or a bass instrument. And one of the things here that happens when you're even just applying clipping to the low frequencies is that what clipping does is it's going to generate some upper order harmonics. Like it'll add harmonics that aren't there. And I could see, first of all, doing that in mastering. Like say you have someone who submitted a mix and there's a kick drum or an 808 that has a ton of 50 or 60 hertz on it, but it just sounds indistinct. Like they didn't brighten up the kick drum enough. If it's the only thing that's hitting at 50 or 60, you could put a ton of clipping just at 50 or 60, potentially even run that in parallel. So what you have is you're adding on some of the missing mid-range harmonics or upper low frequency harmonics that are going to make that kick drum now audible across a wide variety of systems, because what makes you hear a kick drum isn't 50 and 60 hertz. It's, 500 hertz, 1K, 2K, 4K, 5K, depending on the genre. Maybe in hip hop, it's more like, 200 hertz to 1K. That's where the audible part of the kick drum lives. Maybe on a metal track, it's, 2K to 5K or something. But
yeah,
being
I think
able
exactly.
to add
and it might not even live in the low end. Like in this case, right, I'm overdoing everything for YouTube, but if I go to the mid-range, like exactly what you were saying.
Oh my God, I'm just playing with them now, yeah. Oh my God, what she saying, say it loud, yeah. I can't respect it, I'm in the gym, but I am not.
So our vocals are there too, so this would probably be a good case where if I had the stems or the individual tracks, I could just go to that 808. And I might not even need to touch the low end, like what you were saying. I could leave that totally unaffected, because a lot of those harmonics are probably already there. I don't need to generate them again. I just need to tweak my mid shift and my crossovers and just kind of hit them a little bit harder so that they're poking through a little bit more.
Yeah, I believe it. All right, let's go through a couple more questions here, and then we'll see if we have some more audio examples. Next one, Attell from Soundtheory is in here answering, saying that the drive is the saturation pre-gain. Let's keep on going here.
He's our main developer. He's the brains behind gullfoss, so take his word,
Nice.
not mine. I could be messing up certain things.
All right. Good to have you in here, Attell. Then Max says, after watching a lot of reviews of Kraftur, I still can't understand if there is an identification for how many dBs I'm clipping. So you could tell us a little bit about that. Are there gain reduction meters in here? Is that a common request? And how do you tell how much gain reduction is happening?
Yeah, that's a great. I'm going to call it a feature request, and I think we're definitely looking at that right now. We had a lot of people that were like, I need some type of indication of how much reduction I'm doing. It's not a compressor, so it's hard to put just like a dB reduction to it. And the fact that there's several different wave shapers and several different paths, the dry, single, and multi, it's a little difficult to assign just a single number to it, but we are looking into it. And that would probably be added over here on the right, where you've got some indication of how hard you're digging into the plugin. But yeah, anything like that, if you write into support, we tag it as a feature request, and we definitely seriously consider those things. So yeah, great question.
And you guys, over the course of gullfoss, have had many feature requests where you ended up coming out with 3 different versions of it. I think when gullfoss was originally released, it was 1 plugin, and now it's 3 plugins, basically, mostly based on feature requests. And I think if anyone bought the first one, they got the upgrade to this full suite of 3 plugins for free. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. Like the original blue gullfoss came out in 2018. And then since then, you've had access to gullfoss Live, gullfoss Master for free of charge. And that whole process of converting over to Apple Silicon and maintaining the plugin through different OS changes, like we really try to take care of our users. And I think we're one of the few companies too where we allow you to kind of activate on almost anything. You don't have to have a dongle. You can do a machine-based activation, and it's really easy to kind of get up and running with our plugins. So
Cool. And speaking of taking care of customers, I believe there's a special intro pricing right now on Kraftur. This plugin, I believe, will be half the price of gullfoss, but right now I think it's almost a third off. So for those of you who want to check it out, there's a significant discount right now. I think it might be down to $69 from $99. So definitely check it out over at Kraftur.com. Soundtheory.com. That is not going to last forever. The plugin just came out like a month ago. So it's special intro pricing. So get on it now if you're interested in that. All right, next questions here. Attell was also giving some answers in here, even stuff that Attell has been answering in our chat. I still want to say them out loud because some people, when they actually watch this video, will be just listening to us and won't see the chat. So I still, even if Attell has done a great job answering these, I still want to ask them out loud because if one person has the question, others are going to too. Dark Trap was saying that this is awesome for trap 808s. So that's great to hear. He was wondering how much latency does it have. Nihar says the latency is super low. I have the plugin and I'm using it already. I think you just showed it 0 milliseconds of latency with 14%
Yeah, so
CPU usage.
we can talk about that a little bit too. Like when I pull up this performance monitor in Studio One, a lot of people will think like this is the end all be all for what the plugin is, how CPU hungry it is. That's not the case. So on Mac, definitely pull up the activity monitor, and then you'll get an actual score for how much that whole DAW software is being dragged down. These are good like estimates, but that's not the whole picture. Studio One's actually a pretty good job in terms of latency. So Kraftur, it reports 0 latency, and analogous to like analog mastering gear, and Andy's probably going to correct me on this, but the wavefront is immediate, but there is group delay. Group delay is, let's see if I can remember this correctly, it's the derivative of the phase information with respect to frequency. So that, in my opinion, is probably where some of the width comes from, because different frequencies propagate through Kraftur at different rates, just like high-end analog mastering gear, right? The moment you go through things with different propagation delays or nonlinear components, you're going to get those frequency separations in phase just because of all the different impedances of those devices, right? They respond differently for different frequencies. So yeah, Kraftur reports 0 because the wavefront's immediate, but there is a little bit of group delay, which is sort of what you want to get, that more 3D effect on the sound stage. But yeah.
Interesting.
And you get a little delay from oversampling too. The oversampling delay is though negligible, so that's why you can't really report it with the group delay because it's different for every frequency. But yeah.
Gotcha. Nihar says, love this one. gullfoss and this are absolutely off the charts. That's great to hear. Dark Trap is happy to see that you have video color grading nerds in the company. We can't necessarily show the true beauty of the difference between those different modes you showed here on the YouTube stream, but it is a great looking plugin. I've got to say, when you're actually using it, the speed and responsiveness of it is way better than what you'll probably see on the live stream.
Yeah, and I think when you do a screen capture, it doesn't. I think on Mac, I think it doesn't capture that HDR. So you do have to kind of download the trial and make sure your screen supports it, and it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Mika says, how do you run the hard clipping section, and how can you see the clipping amount in dB? That question came in before we answered the clipping amount in dB, but how do you run the hard clipping section? Basically, there's just the ceiling control on the far right. So the drive control, if you increase the drive, you'll be going harder into all of the clippers. The soft clippers, the single band and multiband one that you see on the left, as well as the hard clipper that's turned on with that clip button at the far right. And the additional control you have there is the ceiling control. Does that ceiling control also go positive if you want to turn off the hard clipper, or is it only go negative?
Yeah. Let me play around with that. Okay, so this will be like an acoustic track here. So these are the output band meters, and with my ceiling at 0, those are going to be parked right at 0 if I start slamming into drive, right? So
Sure, I hear that.
Right, all of those are stuck there. So now we can go, well, first we can turn off clip. So now that should actually lets through. notice how those are still at 0, right? Because our transfer curves are still parked at 0 here. So unless we start playing with our shifts or adjusting those. But we can also increase our ceiling. So, and that's on that final. So if I put clip back on, you see this red bar is now where the ceiling is. 3.2. But these bands, which are earlier in the stage, are still parked at 0. So the moment, let's say I go to multiband and I start giving those more headroom so that they can go past 0, we now see those output bands being allowed to go up to where those new ceilings are set. So there's a lot going on. These bands are your output bands that correspond to that transfer curve, right? This vertical axis is in dB full scale. So you do have some way of monitoring stuff. This dB axis translates directly over to this final output meter here, where you can adjust your ceiling and gain. Ceiling is represented by that red rectangle. I think you can also grab it here. Yep. Which the default, we just leave those at 0. And gain is sort of like a makeup gain. Gain is pretty cool, and we're thinking about adding some features here because once your match is pretty stable, it doesn't need to be all that intelligent. And we'll probably add in like a key command where the average match value can just get sent right down to gain. And now you just have a static makeup gain or negative gain, whichever one you want, so that you can A/B without the RMS processing side of match too. So
Gotcha. All right. We've almost an hour here now, so I want to start wrapping this up shortly. But this has been absolutely great. I think there's it's so simple. Like there's only a handful of controls here, but obviously there's tremendous depth here. Dark Drop says it would be cool to try using clipping only the mids or something to shape a voice, for example. Sid says, this is crazy. I can still hear the differences even on my phone speakers. And there's some questions in here about the crossover points and phase-related changes. And Attell has some great detailed answers here to this. It is mixed phased, and he does say there's
I'll make one comment on that too.
Crossovers. Yeah, go ahead.
There's and this is my own personal opinion, but there's been a lot of people that are really going hard on like, I want linear phase. I need linear phase.
There's trade-offs with linear phase. People act like there's no trade-offs from linear phase, but go ahead.
I mean, I think it was an issue with like pre-ring and stuff, but there's been other videos, like I think Dan Worrell's got a pretty good one, and there's other things where you can now design a linear filter to be good enough where, you know, it does its thing. But the majority of analog gear that's made some of our favorite records, like that's not linear phase. And it's interesting because it's a spectrum, right? Linear phase is sort of at one extreme, and the filters we use in Kraftur they're not at the other extreme. They're actually somewhere in the middle. So there might be people complaining like, oh, there's, you know, crossovers and there's things going on there. We've designed it with, you know, the best sound in mind. It's not that we can't do linear phase. If we really wanted to, we could put it on there. But we've tried to make a lot of the behind the scenes decisions so that the sound is it's easy to get to a place where things sound good. And if you're really bugged out by the crossovers, I mean, don't use them. You could stick on single band and go between single band and dry. I mean, Jimi Hendrix probably never used anything multiband, and he did just fine. So we're just trying to bring new things to the table. So yeah.
Yeah, I suppose if there was enough demand, you could, like you did with gullfoss, do a maybe master version of Kraftur that's all, you know, linear phase and has like twice the CPU usage and twice the latency or something. I guess such things would be possible, but
it might not be worth it. And I think Andy has so much expertise on the type of filters and where we want to go, because at the end of the day, it's all tied back to how humans perceive sound.
Yes.
And there's a lot of heavy lifting that, you know, the auditory perception model that Andy came up with is doing. And it's hard to explain to people that are complaining on YouTube and forums. And Andy loves explaining, and it just takes time to be able to draft out the response. And then for the audience to understand his line of processing too, because it's, that's a real nerdy world to get into. But
I'd be happy to have one of your... Yes, actually listen with your ears to how it sounds. And,
I just use my ears. And
I'd be happy to have one of your designers on one of these days and just have a conversation that's all about linear phase and stuff. That we could totally nerd out about it. Attell does write in to say that there are obvious downsides being CPU usage and latency, but there's also the issue of dispersion of band energy with linear phase, which is amplified by distortion and results in transient smearing. So yeah, there's always trade-offs. A pre-ringing you had mentioned earlier, especially with older linear phase EQs, that can be an issue. But we're almost at the hour mark here, so we're going to cut it off at this point. This has been absolutely fantastic. If people want to try this out, just go over to soundtheory.com, type in Kraftur into the search engine machine. You will find it. You'll get a free trial, and if you like it, it's like 30% off right now. So go check it out in this special discount period. Eddie, thank you so much for being here. We'd love to do more. I mean, we could have done even more audio examples. We could have gone another hour. We could do another hour on gullfoss one of these days. If you come out with a new update, I'd love to have you back on. Tell me about gullfoss or your other new plugins. Thanks for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Coletti of SonicScoop with Eddie Ruff of Soundtheory. See you next time.